workshop is where we get a chance to try out some of the ideas that we've been thinking about and talking about. So I have had a chance already to talk to you and to try and use a workshop approach, even when we were in a very large group. However, I've been thinking about this for a while, and so what I want to share with you, that's me again, is what I've got in mind. So we have our giant projection here. Can we read it nice and close? I think so. We have learning objectives. This is a discipline as an educator, to even in informal teaching. I think it's important to have a structure, to know exactly what we're going to try and get out of this, so that I can hopefully wrap everything up so that you go away with a sense of accomplishment, achievement. A big complex world, however, we've made something useful of it. So here are my objectives. As a result of this session, by the end of it, you, participants, will be better able to. So these are the things I thought would be useful. You'll be better able to plan learning sessions where the learner is at the forefront of your plan. And that was a message from each of the three speakers, wasn't it? It's not about your performance in your mind, it's about their performance and what's going on in their minds. And so we have to be able to empathise and to build that into our plans. Next, we need to be able to monitor people's body language and what they actually tell us, so that we can minimise dips in their ability to concentrate and engage with learning, and spot things and respond, and hopefully optimise how we interact with people. Now, we're human beings. It's Friday afternoon. You've travelled here. We've been talking at you for a while. You're only human. We will need to have rests, breaks, a bit of a drink and a chat and a visit to the facilities. These are all physical things which contain our ability to engage with material. But also, we need to try and respond to what learners are telling us. So I want us to think about how often we actually ask learners to tell us about their experience. Sure, we can watch them and see when they fall asleep, but it would be really good if we could both discuss learners and educators frequently about how to make things better without it being an argument or a complaint. So some ideas about feedback and regularly asking people for information about how it's going for them. And I guess one thing I thought I could rely on would be that you might have some challenging situations of your own. And it's always easier to help someone else with their challenging situation. So I thought one thing we could do is identify a challenging situation for you and actually ask another little expert panel to help us with it and make some suggestions. So we will be advising each other on our challenges. So those are the objectives that I want us to achieve. And here's my plan for how to do it. So our outline in time. We've got to keep things moving. So first of all, I'm just going to do very briefly a little bit of more input, talk to you, but then I'm going to ask you to apply these and to carry out some activity. I'm going to share with you a teaching plan, and I'm going to ask you how you would improve it. How can we improve it? What advice can we give ourselves to how to make something more learner-centred? Then I'm going to, as I say, talk about identifying what feedback mechanisms you use, and I've got a couple of examples of things that I use to share with you that might be useful for you. And then, as I said, identify your challenges and give each other advice on things. And at the end, as a sort of summary, there is always the online interactive, the Socrative quiz, which I set earlier, which should make a lot more sense to you now because you've had the teaching on it. So I'm trying to vary, bit of talk, bit of activity, talk or example, activity. And that generally is a good way to maximise learning. So I don't want to talk too long, and I want you to be engaged in working productively with each other. So let's keep going. We're trying to maximise the quality and quantity of effort from our learners. So I've got a colleague, and she's on the BBC at the moment. She was on a science programme talking about her teaching. And so I found a clip. This is Professor Liz Sockett, I'm going to show you in a moment. And she's teaching first-year students about microbiology. So it's a basic scientific subject. They've got very little knowledge so far, but it's trying to enthuse them, engage with them, get them going. And even in an enormous lecture theatre with very young students, she creates some interaction, some activity. So I want you to watch the clip, and I want you to note down any specific things she says or does which help to gain a sense of an audience communicating with their lecturer. Okay, so I'm now going to launch. Of course, we've tested this half a dozen times. Let's hope this time it works. It worked every other time. So she's using a basic technique, asking questions to students in lectures. So something we can all do.
Your average class, I'd probably break it about 4 times with a straightforward question. And in many of the subjects I teach, it's easier to ask a question than in prions, because I know that the chances of someone out here having had like a relative with a prion disease is very rare. There's only 130 in the UK. But there are many more times where I can give examples of, you know, who's got relatives who work in hospitals, and do they go to work in their uniform? Do you think that's a good idea? Do you think that's a safe thing to do? You know, a lot of much more domestic microbiology questions, yeah? And so I do that quite a lot, and they respond. And it's quite usual that, you know, 3 or 4 hands go up out of a class this size, and people will quite willingly offer comments. But you know, I like that about even a class this size. I mean, there's 150, 160 kids in this class.
And their first year.
Their first years.
Yeah.
And from day one, if you establish that you're going to do question and answer with them, that's great, because they'll do it. Prion diseases weren't well known until really the 1980s, when more research was done on them. But there were, as I say, some known predispositions to getting this degenerative brain disorder. Has anybody heard of this disease called Kuru? Wave if you have. Yes. Do you know anything about Kuru? Yeah, at least. Okay, so Kuru was a disease that was known from the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. And it was restricted to a group of people who still practiced a form of human cannibalism. Yeah? Okay. And, right, you are quite correct. The way this cannibalism worked was that it was thought good to eat the brains of your forebears. So if someone in your family died and they had been a great person, it was an honor to eat their brain, right? And that would transfer across to you some of their properties. We just have an atmosphere where people will ask things. A lot of people come up at the coffee break. This is a great slot because I have 2 hours. And so the coffee break, people come and ask me things. And I use them in the second half. If someone's asked me something good, I'll use it in the second half.
Okay. Relatively dry microbiology subject. So we've watched the video. At your tables, discuss with each other, what did you see? Thank you. So usually I will warn you about, I will give you an idea of what I will ask of you. So this time I am not going to ask you to talk to the whole room about the discussions you had at your table. The reason I'm doing this is I want you to be considering the ideas from the context in which you teach. Because I know some people may be working with patients, as Elsa was mentioning. Some people, hands up anybody who is giving a big lecture or giving talks with a lot of knowledge. Anybody here does that? Hands up. Anybody who does that? Yeah, yeah. So that situation was an example of a lecture with knowledge, which is one of the most difficult situations to get people to communicate with you. But even if you're in a small group, you have to plan things so that people will talk to each other. So part of my plan for this is to form 4 little groups here of people who now know a bit more about the circumstances in which you work. And so you can help and work with each other. Now, what I noted from that example were some observations of what Liz Sockett was doing, and they apply in each of these different circumstances. She set expectations for the learners. She made it clear right from the beginning that here we do interact. I will ask you a question and I will wait till somebody waves or answers or does something. That is the norm. So she's setting expectations and rewarding the people who behave in that way, and then everybody can use that. Particularly if you are going to be teaching over a period of time. Obviously, if you set an expectation, you can then use it ever after. She uses questions which she's carefully identified anybody can answer. So instead of saying, what is the cleverest thing you can say about the topic, she says, does anybody have a relative who works in a hospital? Okay, so what do you think about people going to work in a hospital in their work clothes and going home? These are things that everybody can have an opinion or a response to, and yet they have a clear relationship to the topic. She is discussing the transfer of prion-related illnesses which can be transferred through eating or on items of clothing or cutlery, I believe. So she is using things which people can relate to, which are directly related to her topic. What else? She uses very precise language, and both speech and body language. She looks pleased when she gets a reply from people. She repeats what she has been given so that everybody can share it. So these are all techniques that we can use which will make people want to interact with you more, not less.
It's strange, we felt it's right the opposite. We felt she does not interact efficiently.
Oh, right, okay.
Well, she asks questions, but these are rather simple yes-no answers then. And those answers that can be expected do not lead to the slides that follow.
Well, we didn't see what followed. And the context, remember, these are 18-year-old students in their first lectures. So this is starting from having a very low level. So they were designed to be very easy questions with a general relationship with the topic. So that may be unhelpful in your setting. You would have to be more specific and guess your level better.
We weren't sure whether it was just a fake thing you were doing with us. But it's trying to find out that it is not.
Oh, you mean because of Jose's bit?
We didn't see it that positive.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, it was real. It was not faked. And when we are doing things for real, sometimes they are slightly different to what we expect. But no, that was real. Yeah. And I still consider it is an example of good practice for that level, for that type of teaching. And it may not transfer directly into your setting at all. So that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is for your level, could you identify specific questions that people can answer and build from there? Can you show enthusiasm and encourage people to interact? And that will be very different if you're talking to a family and 3 patients from if you're talking to, I don't know, postgraduate trainees who've come to Prague to do specific training on a topic. But it wasn't a trick. It wasn't a trick. Just to specify what she wrote down, these were what she actually said. So have you got relatives that work in hospitals? So really general, ordinary, humdrum, basic question. Nothing clever here. She had a basic technique, wave. Just show that you've heard me. Okay. But for that audience, that's actually quite appealing and makes them feel that they're important and that they matter and that the lecturer is a live person and not just a piece of television that they can just switch off. It's real people in a room with each other. So, okay. So that Kuru. Does that help at all, or do you still sceptical?
No, I still do not see that. For example, because she very often looked at the slides. She didn't look at the audience, for example, and try to.
Yes, and I think the camera angle didn't do her any favours, because the angle made it look like that. But yeah, I think showing examples is really hard, because you either have an acted version where it's somebody trying to be perfect, or an acted version with somebody trying to be terrible, and neither of those things are actually that helpful. So this was a real human being doing an okay, good job, such as you will be able to achieve in your workplaces, I hope. But do you know what? It's really hard to get people to volunteer to be videoed and have their genuine practice critiqued by others, although that is what is happening for me now. And that's because it's really easy to sit there and say all the things that is wrong with something. And it's actually very hard to create perfect. Well, it's not possible to create perfect things, is it? So when I have a lot of examples of real practice, I will share more. But yeah.
To be honest, the criticisms that we're doing at this point is not because we could do any better. It's just, I know that it's really difficult, and we all appreciate that fact. But like, if you have a question, wave if you have, and then we don't see the response, but there are a couple of hands most probably. It would be nice to give a feedback to the groups that we have a couple of hands in the audience. Okay, it's a few people on it. Anything simple, but to show that you said something to me, I saw that, I appreciate that, let's go back to it. So we didn't get that feeling at this table.
Okay, yes. So it wasn't quite the best way of showcasing those things, but you can imagine more of the same, how you would build that interaction. So thank you. Okay. So moving on, what I'm wanting to illustrate are, remember the approaches to learning we had earlier. We sometimes need to give very clear, good explanations. So some spoon feeding is good. Sometimes we need to work in teams and construct complex, multifaceted pictures of the same thing, like our building. Sometimes we need to make sure we are preserving and building curiosity. So when people do research projects, for example, that is a chance for them to really lead something themselves. Quite often people have to do real things under supervision in reality, and that's not always ideal, but we want them to learn from that. And sometimes we need to try and nurture people and encourage them to do better and do more. Now, what I want to move to next is thinking about lesson plans. Now, can you, anybody willing to share, to tell us, do you plan lessons with a lesson plan? Anybody? Yeah, some of you. And some of you, I'm sure, have been doing this have been teaching for a long time. But when I first started teaching, I really resented doing a lesson plan because it was a very disciplined, it was a form, it didn't seem to fit what I wanted to do. However, I think there are certain very important things I learnt from using a structured, disciplined approach to planning a session. And I want to use that now to describe a session which somebody has planned, which is a perfectly good session. But as we've already been discovering, we've got lots of ideas about how we could improve people's sessions. So I first of all just want to explain how I'm going to describe a whole plan for teaching. I am going to use a teaching plan form like this. So here's the start of the lesson plan. So what is it that's happening? How long have I got? What things am I going to take with me? What resources do I have? How am I going to motivate people to start with, to make them want to learn this? What is the bridge that I am going to build so that they know that this is important to them? Is there something they're supposed to have done beforehand, before you reach? How do I know what level they are at? Did I give them a quiz, a test? Do I do it now? how do I know? And then what are my learning objectives? Okay, so these are fairly standard things you might try and find out before you do a session. Yes? So then let's have a look at the further bit of the plan. Now, down here we have, for the length of time you have, you might be able to fit in certain stages of activity. And you write down what you are going to do, what the teacher is going to be doing during that time. You might write down how long you plan for it to take in minutes. You might write down what resources you need. But what I wanted to highlight for you in this plan are two columns that I have coloured in here. The learner activities. So what I was taught many years ago was to always specify what it is I am expecting the learner to do at that time. So you might have instructor gives brief introduction to the nature of the condition, the learner listens. And then it becomes very clear if the learner is just listening and not doing anything else at all. So it is a way of trying to discipline us to think about varying what the learner is doing in our plan, so that we don't create plans where learners have to listen for 60 minutes at a time. So let me show you with an example. I'm going to show you somebody's plan and ask you to come up with some suggestions, and then I will want to hear from each table some specific suggestions of things we could suggest they do to make this better. So here is the plan. So I tried to invent one which would be meaningful to rheumatologists or other colleagues here. So it's SLE. And let's say I've got a lecture, I've got 75 trainee rheumatologists together. And look, I've got 55 minutes. It's all written up in the textbook chapter. I'm going to motivate them by mentioning the exam. I'm assuming they've read it and they should be ready for this. And then I've got my objectives, look, and they're very sensible. I'm going to outline the epidemiology. And then I'm going to describe and explain and evaluate what are the important factors. And then I'm going to describe clinical manifestations. So this is all very sound, competent plan, isn't it? But what do you think might go wrong? That's a rhetorical question. This might end up being all focused on what the teacher is doing rather than what the learner is doing. And that's where I need your help. So let's say this is another sensible part of the plan. So I'm going to present basic information. They listen and make notes. I've got 43 PowerPoint slides. And I'm planning to whiz through them in 35 minutes. But then I remember that last time I did it, it took 44 minutes because usually one slide takes 1 minute. But I'm sure I can do it quicker this time because I know it better, maybe. And then I'm going to, I should always put things in a clinical context. So I'm going to have one clinical case and I'm going to talk through it with my wise experience. I'm going to give them an explanation of the progression. I've got 12 slides and they just follow me. And then, I'm supposed to ask them to interact with me. So then I'm going to ask some questions at the end. And then I've got one summary slide because I've been trained to ask for questions and then summarise. And then if there's any spare time, I'll open it up again and ask them some more questions. So this is, it's a reasonable plan, but in the light of what we've been discussing, I think this could be improved. So I would like you at your tables to come up with 2 or 3 sensible suggestions that you might suggest to this. Say this was your colleague and they'd come to you. What things would you recommend that they change about this plan to make it more centred on the learner? Okay, so are there things that you would change about the timing, the structure, or possibly introduce an activity? So over to you. I'm going to give you at least 5 minutes or maybe slightly more to discuss this, and then I want us to hear from each table some specific suggestions about how to improve this plan. Does that make sense? Over to you. So, the art of small group discussion is to disappoint everybody slightly. Okay, so some people have had enough. Some people would like to carry on. So let's now visit each group for just a quick insight into their discussion. So let's start with this group. You have a suggestion for this person. How could they make their plan more learner-focused?
Yes, right. So first for the engaging, the written, we thought that they could present, the teacher could present a case with the same age as the student, which is related to language but also
Clever.
So this is the case of a medical student who, and then after that, do a pre-assessment with that case, and actually they could use the Socrative device. After that, the teacher will do a differential diagnosis, and it will be all the time interacting, no slides so far. And we will end with questions on questions.
Okay, so you move the clinical, real situation right to the start, and you make it really relate to the learners in the group. This could be you, either as a doctor or a patient. Okay, thank you. Exciting. How about table in the middle? Where would you focus? Just act natural.
We agreed. We also had the same suggestion about starting with the case.
Mm-hmm.
But another suggestion was that the first part of the lecture here, you said that it will have 43 slides. This is a lot. And I would stop after pathogenesis, for example, and allow a little bit of interaction, and then go back to the rest of the lecture as well.
Yes, I completely agree. Smaller chunks of a few slides of information and then an activity. A few slides and then an activity. Yeah. And to try and reduce.
Another thing is that so we think that the topic is what you mentioned here is a bit that the first part you can just read it in a book. So it should be a bit more illustrative or animated, not to be just like reading a book.
Yes, so we have to make it special when you're actually in a room with people. What can you do when you're in a room to interact that you can't do when you're reading or on the computer? You can ask questions, you can try things out, you can see how other people do it, you can see what your performance is like compared to others. There are all sorts of other things you can only learn in groups. So thank you, that's great. Now add to our range of activities.
Well, we had more or less the same issue, so we would also start with a clinical case to get more interaction with the audience, and maybe do a small quiz to get the students more involved, but also to have a little bit of an assessment how much the students know, and then afterwards talk more about the topic, but also with interaction questions to keep them focused.
Great, and then the challenge is then to be able to manage those timings and the handing over of control from being a person standing at the front talking all the time to let them do something and get control back, because that's a new area of skill. But thank you. You anticipated all and more of the things I was thinking about, which is good. So I did particularly think it would be a really good idea to start with a basic case to bring that forward to the start. And maybe to set expectations that they should read the chapter before they get there. So do the homework before class, not after. And then we can make the most of class. Cut down the number of slides, because you'll reduce them to 30. Okay. If you can't say which is the most important slide in your presentation, you don't really know your presentation. Damn, I'll have to think of which is the most important slide in this presentation. As we suggested, break it down into smaller sections with an activity, build the complexity. Maybe they won't get to the most complex case. Maybe they will. In years of having an extra activity, I don't think I ever used them, but I feel better that I've got it. But if you want to do things, do the right things and do them properly. You might use some kind of interactive voting or simple technique to check they're keeping up. Another idea that we're moving into feedback now, you could have an expectation where students can request a fuller explanation or a repetition every time you give them a talk. So you say, these are the 3 choices, vote for which one you'd like me to explain again. And this gives you feedback. It informs you which is the bit that they're still not clear about. Okay, so they think they're learning, but actually you are also learning about them. So thank you. You had all of those suggestions and more. So that helps us move into this area of knowing a bit more about what our learners' experience is and finding ways to ask them and for them to politely tell us, which is what we're thinking about next. I'm going to move through this actually. We're going to be talking about examples. These are really key questions about how to evaluate how your learners are doing and how to get feedback. So ask yourself this: how do you give opportunities to show you and your students how well they're doing? So it's one of those, these are the questions that inspectors have when they come in to determine whether your teaching is good or not. They sound really simple questions, but they're actually very telling and acute questions. Because if your answer to that is, I don't give opportunities to demonstrate to myself or my learners how well they're doing, that is not really an adequate answer. So what do you... And also, I wait till the end and they get the exam result and they fill out a questionnaire. That is not the best answer. So remember what Reg was saying about opportunities for assessment for learning. So this is why, quizzes and activities and things are important. So you are giving opportunities for students to see how well they are doing and for you to see how well they are doing. How do you make sure that students feel comfortable seeking help and asking questions? And that was what Liz Sockett was saying, that when they have a break and they chat, she identifies students who she's already had a conversation with that she can build on that conversation later. So do people only seek you out after the event or informally, or can you structure questions into a session? Do students know what they should do if they need extra help? Are you interested in it? And are your learners interested in doing this? And how do you demonstrate that? So how do you know that your learners are motivated and share your learning objectives? Most of the time, we just guess, don't we? Is that true? We guess and we hope for the best. But I wondered if there were some other ways that we could do this. What ways do you collect feedback about how you're doing at the moment? Anybody got a suggestion?
Yes.
Yeah.
There's one that I really like. I'm trying to get a feedback each time I give a talk. I'm trying to collect information as much as possible.
Yeah,
but if
great.
there is not an appropriate way of doing it, people are shy. They usually come
Of
to
course.
say, "Oh, we really loved it," but you don't get the negative feedback, so it's not
Yeah.
helping me. There is just one thing that I really love. In the university, if you're talking in the ground round to the whole university, after the session, you get an anonymized feedback from everybody. So you get 20, like a full 10 pages of results. For each item you get a comment, and at the end you have free recommendations. So it's that really helps me a lot. It has to be not face-to-face, it has to be anonymized, and it has to be formal, not coming from the speaker, coming from the structure.
Okay, so that's one way that's done, yeah. And I don't know about you, but personally, I find the feedback people write is much more valuable than being given a score. Yeah, and so that's the feedback I really treasure and look at carefully. However, when it's anonymous, sometimes people say things that are either silly sometimes, or hurtful or unrealistic. And so we have to look after ourselves, I think, in that process. We have to educate our learners to be able to give us good quality information. Anybody use any other ways, anything informal? Something I use, something I use, I might have a slide at the end of a talk or a session, and I might have a sign saying, right, I'm now going to ask you, I'm going to hand out Post-it notes to everybody. I'm going to ask you to just anonymously write on this something you'd like me to stop doing. Am I saying all the time? Or, you know, am I explaining something again and again? Is there something you'd like me to stop doing? Is there something you'd like me to start doing? Would you like me to start giving you more time to ask and answer questions? But also, is there something you'd like me to continue doing, to carry on doing? So again, you've got a workshop about feedback, and feedback is very much about knowing accurately what it is that's working well, and so you should keep doing it, and what it is you are doing that you maybe don't know, or to allow people a way to give you constructive suggestions that only they can know about because they're the learner. Okay. So, I mean, for one thing, I always try and do things like stand at the back of any room I'm teaching in so that I know what it feels like for a learner on the back row. That is a very good way of teaching you about your overheads, because from here and on a computer, they look very different from when you're actually a learner. Things that look sensible in a textbook, when they're 80 feet high, look very different. And so there are a number of ways we need to get information from the perspective of the learner. But here's another example I came across, which was on student engagement, which was to share a rating system with your learners to say, we're going to vote each time about how engaging that session was, how much that was interesting to me. And one of the ways you know if something is interesting is if time goes quickly, then it was probably quite interesting. So the class was really good, time went by very quickly. So you can share this scale with your learners, and they can vote, they can, you know, hold up Post-it notes that have different colours to say 5 or 1 or whatever. They can hand something in, they can use an interactive game, and so you can tell on this shared scale every time, was it too fast or too slow? You could, every now and then, ask them if they'd like you to go faster or slower, and just make that part of what you discuss. Socrative also has some things. You can have a space race or an exit ticket, have an explore of those. They are a way. An exit ticket is a quiz that allows somebody to show that they've learned what they should have learned in that, and then they can exit. A space race is when people work together to answer questions together, and they can see the result on the screen happening like a horse race. Okay, so there are just some ideas about generating feedback and regularly asking and collecting that information from your learners. So, time is moving quickly in this session, certainly for me. So what I wanted to do was to just make sure you had a chance to identify and respond to challenging situations in your settings. So can I ask you to define at each table a challenging teaching situation? And then we can ask the whole room whether we've got some suggestions for it. So a minute to think of a challenging teaching situation. So let's keep slightly more minutes for our answers than our problems. Anybody ready to spell out a problem swiftly that we could think about?
Yeah, different levels.
Different levels. So how do we respond to very different levels of learners in the same group? Is that your issue? Yeah, okay. What suggestions do we have?
We always start with your lecture with the very basic, because you have to start at your weakest point, towards your weakest attendant, and then you build it up.
Yes, and one little tip, don't say, this is so easy, everybody will get this right. Because if then they get it wrong, everybody is disappointed. Yeah. Okay, so make sure you start at a level where everybody can perform, which is what Liz Sockett was trying to do. Any other suggestion for managing different levels?
Depends what kind of lecture you have.
Indeed.
So if I have a course with experts in one topic, then I know that they are already experts. I do a pre-assessment, or I say you can only come to this course if you already reached these and these levels, and then you can come, then I know they have already this knowledge.
That's true, but even in a room full of experts, their levels of expertise still varies. So I do a lot. So I think one tip I have is to just share that information and say, I know there are people with great detailed expertise in this and perhaps less in this. So I'm now going to explain this area, and this may be very straightforward to some of you. And try and make sure that you share that each person is going to get something specialist, but something general. Yeah.
We had a course some months ago, and to attend this course, you have to do a multiple choice question.
Okay, yes, yes.
And only if you reached 65%, you could go to the course. If not, you couldn't go.
Yeah. So that is the do the homework before you start the course model. In the UK, we call that the flipped classroom, and it is becoming more popular because it solves some of these problems. It focuses the learner on being ready for the opportunity rather than just thinking they can turn up and make the teacher do all of the work.
I'm sorry, but there still be a difference between the person accomplished 65% and the rest of the 100%. I'm sorry, but it is a huge difference between them. I'm sorry.
Yes, that is what I'm saying. That is the reality. You may have a world expert in one thing. Yeah, yeah. And we have to disappoint most people a bit because that's the nature of all being in a lecture and hearing the same thing. So,
with the tip you were saying, for example, I think well, if you don't explain it from the beginning, the audience that knows everything about this may be feeling very uncomfortable about your skills to present something. However, if you say that, that person will think that, okay, I know more than the rest of the group, so if I stay patient, I will be able to get something at the end. So it may increase the communication between the presenter and the student, let's say. However, it's not going to change the fact that that person will get the least out of the group. And I don't think it's the fault of the speaker.
no, there gets to a point in your career where actually you should be giving the courses and writing the books. There is no course for you. So just to bring this back to our summary, just here. So we were thinking about planning learning sessions where the learner's at the front of the plan, and we all shared some suggestions for that. We were minimizing how people's attention fluctuates and making sure that we respond to that and plan for that, and also identifying and proposing solutions to challenging situations in your own teaching. And learning is a complex field, and good luck to you in all your different situations, but I just hope I've highlighted some ways of thinking and some ways of responding and getting feedback to help you to make the most in your different situations. So thank you very much. Thank you.